Black Earth offers a full suite of humic solutions, from high-purity granules to powder, liquid, and soluble formulations, all powered by pure humulite. Trusted by growers worldwide from one of the world's rarest humulite reserves. Grow stronger with the power of Black Earth Humulite. Learn more from Mind to Market by visiting blackearth.com.
You're listening to Ruminating with RealAg, the podcast that chews on the latest in beef production, with your host, Amber Bell.
I'm Amber Bell, and this is Ruminating with RealAg. For today's episode, I have joining me Dr. Emily Fairfax, who's an assistant professor of geography that specializes in ecohydrology with the University of Minnesota, and Norine Ambrose, who's the executive director with Cows and Fish, which is a nonprofit stewardship organization that promotes healthy landscapes by fostering riparian stewardship. Now, together we're going to be talking about beavers, which is one of Emily's favorite topics, and of course, Norine and I both love beavers as well. We're going to be talking about how beavers and cattle can work to change the riparian landscape. So it's going to be a fascinating conversation. Listen in. Hello, Emily and Norine. How are you guys today?
Really great, thank you.
Doing awesome.
So I'm really excited for this episode. I think that beavers have always been on my mind. I love seeing beaver dams, love getting to see them when I'm out in pastures. And this is going to be really unique because we'll start off with you, Emily. Tell us a little bit about your work with beavers.
Yeah, so I am an ecohydrologist, which means that I study the interactions between living things like beavers and water. And a lot of my research in recent years has really focused on the ways that when beavers go in and build their wetlands, they are providing us with climate resilience benefits, with drought buffering, with flood buffering, and even with wildfire protection.
That was very succinct. I love it. And then yourself, Noreen, tell us about your work with Cows and Fish.
Yeah, our work is really about fostering stewardship of riparian areas, those areas near water. So the floodplain, the stream banks, the margins of lakes and wetlands. And of course, it's the connection between land and water. So which is where the cows and the fish come in. It's not, it's not about one or the other. It's about how do we work with those things together. So we do work with a lot of agricultural producers on managing riparian areas. So grazing management strategies. We work with people around lakes and things too, but for today's purpose, the agricultural aspect is how do you graze a riparian area effectively and keep it healthy? And a big part of having healthy riparian areas, of course, is also beavers because they are ecosystem engineers. They are part of the landscape and they actually help form a lot of our systems and change them and store water. So they're pretty important for livestock, but they also cause some consternation, flooding things people don't want flooded, plugging things people don't want plugged. So we'll talk more about that.
Right. And for any ranchers listening and people listening in general, how would you guys describe a riparian area? What is a riparian area?
That's a great question. I remember distinctly when I first started working in this field, I didn't even know how to pronounce riparian. I was like, what? What is this jargon? But the way most people are using riparian area is it's the ecosystem and the landscape and the soil and the water that's immediately adjacent to your streams, your rivers, your flowing water corridors. And so sometimes it's a wetland, sometimes it's a forest, sometimes it's been mowed down to nothing, but it's that area that's right next to your streams.
Yeah, and I think the important part is it has more water than what comes from precipitation. It's got the water because it's next to a water body, so you have different kinds of soils and plants that can handle and generally like that extra water. So it's from an agricultural perspective, it's very productive usually because it's more well watered, and a lot of North America is on the dry side compared to some tropical places. So extra water is generally a good thing in agriculture. But it's also more sensitive because it is wetter. The soils are more compactable. And, there's lots of other things that we expect that place to do, like filter runoff, trap sediment, provide productivity, habitat, obviously, and lots of other sort of ecological functions and values as well. And from a cows and fish perspective, we're generally saying that those features actually apply to all water bodies, even human-made, like dugouts and canals, man-made lakes. All of those places can develop riparian areas over time because basically water seeps out and the soil and the plants respond. So we're normally talking about natural riparian areas, but they do exist around human-made water bodies as well sometimes.
I have a question about that because I've heard from landowners that, let's say we've been through tons of years of drought in the last little while. It feels like the water systems have changed. Is there a certain point where something that was a riparian area is no longer classified as one?
It can happen, but generally speaking, we're talking about really long periods because you're talking about how soil changes. So, it didn't become riparian overnight, and it takes decades and millennia. So, a dry water body can still have a riparian area. The creek might go dry, the slough might be dry, the wetland. Doesn't mean the riparian area goes away after a year or two. It's just dry or drier. Just like the creek is still there with no water in it. It's still a creek.
Right. Do you have a comment on that, Emily, at all?
Yeah, I mean, they definitely don't always have to have water in them. The riparian zones around intermittent streams, ephemeral streams, streams that every year go dry are still really critical habitat, really important things to be aware of and to monitor and to manage. I would say that sometimes when we focus on the riparian area being defined just by the water, which is sort of the foundation of what it is, we forget why the water is there, and that's the shape of the physical earth for the most part.
Right.
It is our topography. Sometimes it's groundwater springs, and so then it's our underlying geology, but it takes a lot of time to change that. We probably can if we work hard enough and scrape away a mountain, but most people aren't doing that. So even if you do have a drought, even if you do have water diversions, the riparian area is still there and can be revitalized because the shape of the earth still does support it.
Right. Let's get into talking about beavers. So, Noreen, you mentioned them being ecosystem engineers, and I believe from watching some of your videos, that's a term you use as well, Emily. Now, what actually do they do in riparian systems?
Yeah, so an ecosystem engineer is going to be an animal or plant that has an outsized effect on the physical environment around it. So they are physically changing their environment. When that's beavers, they're doing it in a lot of ways that are pretty dramatic. So they build dams. They are going to be cutting down trees, moving stones, excavating mud to build an earthen and organically made dam. These can be small, they can be short, they can be long, they can be tall. They come in all sorts of different shapes and sizes. That's their most obvious type of ecosystem engineering, but they're doing more than that too. So beavers are also master excavators. They go in and they will dig canals, like little microstreams that radiate outwards from their home ponds across valley bottoms, across landscapes. And these function pretty similar to like an irrigation ditch. They are also cutting the trees, which is a form of ecosystem engineering. And that helps us shift from maybe tall, mature, maybe stagnant, overgrown canopy into a much more small patch size, lots of different vegetation communities. You'll have cattails here, you'll have reeds there, you'll have lily pads there, you'll have pine trees there, you'll have conifers there, you'll have hardwoods there, and it's just all mixed together. So they're physically shaping the ecological community, they're physically changing where the water can flow, they're leaving wood chips and organic material everywhere as they go, which changes the soil composition, which then they put more water in to change it further. So there's really nothing about their environment that they haven't physically modified. And one of the things I think is really cool about beavers is they're doing it on purpose. They are trying to make a wetland. And there are a lot of ecosystem engineers out there that maybe they're not doing their engineering as on purpose. Like when buffalo wallow, it's not as on purpose to make a little shallow wetland as when a beaver builds a dam to stop the water to make a wetland.
That's very neat. Do you have a comment on that, Noreen?
Yeah, I think that's a great description. The only thing I would add maybe is that they also change our valley bottoms and our shapes, and that's all the work that Emily just talked about. We sort of think sometimes maybe in a more simple terms when we think, okay, there's a stream and they put a dam on it, so it creates a pond behind that dam. But they also that causes diversions, that causes essentially long-term, almost like berms that even when the beavers are gone are still there. And you can see them from satellite imagery, even hundreds or decades later when there haven't been beavers for a long time. So they really change the whole valley. And if you think kind of more in millennia, the valley bottoms after glaciers left 12,000-ish years ago were much steeper and V-shaped. And beavers have been doing what Emily described for 10 to 12,000 years in northern parts of North America. And now we have flat bottoms in our floodplains because they've trapped material for 10 to 12,000 years. And so really, really changing the shape and the character. But we've also lost them for 100 to 150 years since settlement, basically, in Alberta. That's longer in other places. And that means that we've actually changed the complexity of our stream systems in particular. So obviously some places are dominated by knob and kettle, potholes and sloughs, but we've really changed this connectivity of our systems by removing beavers, because those things aren't happening, and probably increasing erosion, reducing groundwater recharge, because we're not giving those opportunities a chance to happen.
It's really interesting to think of them being removed because I live in an area where we have a huge population of beavers and they're a bit of a pest in on a lot of acreages, right? So it's really interesting to think of that. The other thing that I find interesting about what you guys mentioned is, as I asked the question before, can a riparian area become a non-riparian area through drought or, through changes in the weather? At the same time, you guys are basically saying that riparian areas can be extended and can be changed that way. So those are
Yeah.
both really, really interesting, an interesting way of looking at it because beavers are able to shape that. On the cattle side of thing, how do cattle or animals on the landscape change those riparian areas?
I mean, the most obvious way is, of course, grazing and browsing, changing the vegetation structure and changing the community long term. It's not really short-term removal because plants, especially grasses, grow from the ground each year. So grazing them at a kind of a moderate to light level doesn't really change their plant community, but longer term with moderate to heavy grazing or maybe inappropriately timed grazing or intensity, obviously can change the plant community. You start to take out the preferred species and have less. And kind of you see really oversimplified communities. So you maybe lose the understory in a forest. You have the big trees still, but you don't have much shrubbery and broadleaf plants. Or you move to more, low palatability plants get left behind because cows, if we're talking cows, they eat their favorite stuff first. And if they do that for decades, of course, the favorite stuff disappears and the less favorite stuff tends to expand. In well-managed sites, that's not the case. So that's where kind of balancing that amount of grazing and managing that grazing is important. So really it's about plant community. It's also physical structure. So you certainly along lake shores, wetlands, stream banks, you can see caved out areas, watering sites where there's erosion and bare soil, and what we call pugging and hummocking. So you get those humps and bumps from hoof action in wet soils. And that's like a physical thing that's really hard to heal, actually. Once it's compacted and humpy and bumpy, it does not heal very quickly. It takes a long, long time. And the best solution along streams is it gets flooded and it's covered in new sediment deposition, and then it can start over. But that's, that's a kind of a significant change. It has to happen for that to heal.
Yeah, and I'd add, Norine alluded to this a little bit with reference to like intensity and timing. There's a lot of scales of cattle grazing in the riparian zone and a lot of methods for it. And sometimes I think nuance can get lost when we just say cows in the riparian zone. And that is like a very broad phrase. I could say that I'm a farmer because I grew 6 strawberries and 10 jalapenos this year. But the impacts of large scale farming where you have like 1 million acres is nothing like the impact of my backyard planter box. And so when we think about cattle in the riparian, there are, in my experience, cattle operations that are coexisting beautifully with beavers in the riparian zone, and it's really mutually productive. And then there are cattle operations where cows are being driven in huge numbers through very sensitive watersheds, and we see degradation. And it's not that there is some innate compatibility or incompatibility. It's about choices and how we use the land and how we operate on the land. And timing is a really big part of that, and numbers are a really big part of that.
Yeah,
Right,
really
timing's a big piece.
Yeah, really good clarification, Emily. I think, I wouldn't say that grazing and riparian areas are compatible everywhere, but certainly there's lots of places they can be compatible if those things are being considered thoughtfully and applied. And we certainly see lots of good examples where that stewardship and understanding of sort of how to make that work is there, but also places that it's not working that great.
Can you guys speak a little bit to, because timing I see in 2 different ways. So there's the timing for how long the animals are on a certain riparian area, stream bank, or whatever it may be. And then there's the season. Can you guys speak to that a little bit?
I can touch on the season for a start. So one thing about beavers that not everyone realizes, and beaver wetlands and beaver riparian zones, is that specifically in these systems, beavers have a really specific annual cycle of activities that they're going through, especially if you're somewhere that has a decent amount of snow and cold and ice. So in the winter, they don't hibernate. They're just sitting inside their lodge cozy, and they've cached a bunch of food. And that's like, let's say that's the start of their year. During the winter, maybe damage is happening to the dam from ice, maybe things are leaking. They're really not focused on repair right now. They're focused on stay warm, stay happy. In the spring, they're in a building frenzy. They're trying to get everything ordered. There's little babies in the lodge, probably. It's a big food need, it's a big repair need. And then as they go into the summer and into the fall, they're fixing up dams, they're starting the food cache again, and the cycle continues. When you have a landscape where the beavers are really active and they're already in building mode, in my experience, they can help patch up a broken dam that maybe got stomped on by too many cows, or the plants are already growing really fast and there's plenty of water available, and so you get a little bit more of that spring back. It's more naturally resilient. If you're in the middle of a drought, if a wildfire has just blasted through your area and there's not a lot left and everything's concentrating its forces on these 3 acres of beaver wetland, that's a lot more vulnerable and that's a lot more sensitive. And so in that sense, that maybe be the wrong time to camp out and put all of your cattle there all at once. Maybe let them get the edges, get them in and out. But think about what is the state of the landscape right now, and is it in a place where it can bounce back? And if you just had a mega flood and the beavers are furiously trying to repair everything, maybe don't layer on top of that another disturbance, which all grazing is, whether that's cattle or elk or moose. Grazers in the riparian is a disturbance that normally it can accommodate to some extent, but there are times when that ability to accommodate is very small.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Sometimes we think about it more from the cow perspective or even the plant perspective and not the beaver perspective or the wetland or the creeks perspective. I would say from a timing perspective in sort of keeping the riparian area healthy as a broad overview, grazing can happen at any time, but it's particularly sensitive in riparian areas when the soft, wet soil is the softest and the wettest, because it's more compactable. That physical impact is hard to prevent, and it's really, really hard to heal. So grazing when things are actually not in drought, but drier, like so the soft spring runoff, snowmelt, early summer period, it's really at risk more. And also the plants are just coming out of the ground, and in general, grazing is hard on them at that time. So it's better for them to be a little bit more mature. When the plants are either in drought or really, really dry conditions at the end, trees and shrubs are actually more palatable. So not only do beavers like trees and shrubs, but cows, horses, sheep, goats, they really like trees and shrubs. And most people don't realize this. They think, oh, they eat grass, or maybe they eat broadleaf plants, but they eat a lot of woody plants because they're really nutritious. And even without leaves, so the fall and winter grazing, cows are seeking out woody plants like red osier dogwood, willows that love riparian areas, because they're nutritious and have that. So watching like what are your livestock seeking out, and keeping that browse when they're eating woody plants, it's browsing, it's not grazing. What intensity is that getting to? And really watching for those kind of indicators to manage the level or intensity. And certainly you can have 5 animals in a large area, but if they're always hanging out in the exact same spot, that's very different than those 5 animals being distributed over a long space of time or a long physical opportunity, right? So it's how do you distribute them? Are you providing that rest? They need rest. Plants need rest to regrow so they can regrow again the next year. And looking at those opportunities, do the cows or the whatever other kind of livestock make all the decisions? Or are you controlling their timing or where they spend their time? So looking at those kinds of things to accommodate not only things like beavers, but plant regrowth, habitat, obviously for things like more than beavers. Beavers are great, but of course so are other wildlife. We don't want to suggest that beavers are the only important wildlife. So, you kind of looking at all those things, and accommodating and thinking about that if you're going to graze early in the spring, which is hard on the plants, and maybe conflicts with other things, then what are you doing next year? Are you changing that up or giving it a little additional rest?
You both mentioned sensitive times, sensitive scenarios such as drought or wildfires. Now, are there any signs that that a riparian area is experiencing, a little more stress than normal outside of let's say I just walk into an area? Are there any signs I can look for to know, what, maybe I need to go a little bit more easy on this riparian area?
I think if things aren't growing back from last year,
Mm.
that's a great sign. Sometimes you can attribute a little bit of it to like, oh, well, for the example of beavers disturbing the landscape, they'll chew on trees, they'll cut trees down. A lot of those do grow back the next year. If nothing grew back, then that's not in a good state. In that sense, even the beaver would be causing damage to that riparian zone. It doesn't happen super often. The beavers are pretty good at managing that aspect. But lack of regrowth, if you see really, really turbid water and a lot of stagnant water, that's often a sign that maybe the hydrology isn't all the way there to support that. Too much sediment loading can be an issue. Pollution, if you're seeing a lot of algae growing that wouldn't normally be there, that could be a sign that maybe there's a bit too much runoff coming into the system, and got to give it a minute for that biogeochemistry to clean it up. It's all balances, what comes in has to come out. And if we're just dumping too much in, whether that's too much grazing pressure, too much fertilizer, too much water, too much anything, got to give it a little more time to come out. So basically, I mean, a lot of ag people I know, they know their land super well. And if they're out there looking at the stream and it's looked the same way-ish for the last 15 years and now it looks really bad, I'm sure they realize that.
Stressed.
And yeah, and can give it a break. And I think that it's probably folks that are getting into this newer or that have a new piece of property where you also do want to see how it functions year to year to establish that baseline so you can tell when something's up, because it can be subtle.
Yeah, and sometimes those subtle things, were a little bit last year, and then this year it's, is that a little bit more of that? So that's like that sort of watching for those things that Emily talked about, like bare ground and regeneration. In most of our riparian areas, trees and shrubs are in almost all of in Alberta, in Western North America, but some places, if you're in really like open grasslands or dry prairie sites, or really ephemeral sites, they don't actually have enough water. So they might not have trees and shrubs and you wouldn't expect them, but you'd expect the other plants, the herbaceous plants, the grass-like plants to be regrowing, and watching for those. And if you don't see that, as Emily said, that's the kind of thing you go, something's wrong. Obviously, in a cattle or other livestock grazing situation, if you're seeing your high intensity of manure pack all over the place, cows are probably hanging out there. That's their favorite spot. It's at the bottom of the hill, so they don't have to work. It's got the water. It's got the greenest, yummiest grass. It's usually got some shade. So it's the place to hang out. So also just watching for your actual livestock sign. And that's obviously a pretty good clue too.
Can we talk a little bit about plants? So you mentioned algae, Emily, and talk a little bit about the difference, because I know that there's a lot of well, I won't say a lot, but there's a bit of confusion about algae versus duckweed. Now, can we talk a little bit about plants versus algae?
Yeah, totally. They can be really confusing, and just looking at a water body that has a lot of greenery on it can feel very alarming. I've definitely gone to beaver pond sites that I know are super healthy, and you can't see the water. It's just totally covered in duckweed usually, or some sort of water fern. And you get in there closer and you're like, oh, these are tiny plants. And you can actually see they look like tiny plants. That's the best way. Like, get up and close and personal with your stream, with your water body. You got a handful of little plants. That's not going to be the typical presentation of an algae. Some algae are also totally fine. They can be fibrous, they can be clumpy. What's not great to see are those sort of like stringy, they look like spilled paint a little bit on the surface of the water. That's where we start getting into harmful algal bloom land. That's where we start getting into sort of creating anoxic conditions and really degrading the ecology of your water body. Some of them can be kind of like bluish in tone. Some of them can be really aggressively green. If you're not sure, try to give it a stir. And if it feels like you're stirring a bunch of grass around, it's probably not a toxic or harmful algae. You might still want to open up a little bit of that water. But if it really is, you'll know. If it's looking like really strange and not like something you've seen before, that can be a harmful algae. Another thing to note with the duckweed and with other water plants is many of these are consumed by the things in the water. So routinely, I'm in Minneapolis, we'll get a bunch of duckweed that grows up on the ponds and the lakes around town. And then the next day, it's like a bonanza with ducks, because as the name suggests, the ducks love to eat it. So just because the system looks very disturbed and you might have a big growth of some aquatic plant, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're out of balance yet if the rest of the ecosystem can respond. And I've seen beavers help clear out the duckweed on some of their ponds. A small notch in the dam, whether man-made or beaver-made, can help flush some of the water and get it moving. There's just a lot of back and forth with plant growth on the water surface. Yeah, so I guess take home message. If it looks like tiny plants, don't freak out. If it looks like spilled paint, maybe take a step back.
I don't have anything to add to that.
No comments on that. That is really good. I knew a producer that used to harvest the duckweed and you feed it to his pigs, and it was super nutritious. So there's other uses for it for sure. Do you guys see any surprising similarities in how cows and beavers shape the landscapes?
They're both dramatic. For better or for worse, when they show up and they put their effort on a landscape, you can see it. And I think that's a big way. They both shape waterways. They both exert significant influence on soil properties. And I think one thing that causes a divergence in their sort of impact and abilities to change the landscape is beavers are pretty self-regulating. They're very territorial. So you'll have a family of beavers and they'll set up their territory, which is usually 1 to 2 kilometers of stream length. And then if you get new beavers that try to come in, they will chase them out. And if they won't leave, they will try to kill the new beaver. They really want to protect their resources. So I think where we see that split in impact is both of them can be really influential, but the beavers, you're not going to pack them in and have 85 beavers all damming an acre, but you can have 85 cows all grazing an acre.
That covers it.
Yeah. So with that, that's one of the questions. I guess that goes into a little bit. I've talked to a lot of people out here. Like I said, we have tons of beavers out here. They're a bit of a pest. Now, one of the concerns that a lot of landowners have is beavers have a lot of babies. Where do the babies go then if they're really protective over, their region?
Half of them die before they're adults. Baby beavers are very vulnerable. We only expect about half to make it to adulthood. They stay home with their parents for 2 to 3 years, shadowing them, learning to be better beavers. When they're little, they're born about the size of a sweet potato, and then they grow pretty slowly. So by the time they're 2 to 3 years old, ready to hit the road, they're probably 30 to 40 pounds. Whereas an adult beaver, the maximum weight of an adult beaver that's been recorded is 110 pounds. And we routinely see them in the 80-pound range here in the north. They can be huge. They just keep getting bigger and bigger. But they only have 1 litter of babies per year. So as far as rodents go, they're actually a fairly slow reproducer. In that litter, you're going to have about 1 to 6 kits. That's the babies. And let's say 3 of them at the max end make it to adulthood. During that first journey out, they will travel upstream, downstream, as far as they can to find new habitat that's open. They'll pass through another beaver's territory, get chased out, keep moving. They would like to go, a handful, 10, 20 kilometers to find habitat. If they have to, they can go 80, 100, 120 kilometers, 140 kilometers. They'll just keep hoofing it. That's also another really vulnerable point in their life. And when they set up shop to be a new beaver family for the first time and try to find a mate, a lot of them don't make it through the first winter. So while you do see a lot of beavers maybe on site, especially in the spring when the babies are there, most of those are not going to go out and be part of the population long term. An adult beaver, very hard to be killed by other animals because they are so large once they truly reach like maximum size. You're looking at wolves, really skilled coyotes, bears, cougars being their main predators. But when they're babies, river otters, birds of prey, owls, foxes, bobcats, dogs, raccoons, anything really that wants, if it's the size of a rat, anything that can kill a rat can kill a baby beaver. And we see that.
Any comments on that, Norine?
The only other thing I would say is, to Emily's point about how they're territorial, they will sometimes allow their kids and their grandkids to set up shop close to themselves and stick around. And that's why sometimes you will see what seems like a giant colony of beavers. They will, there'll be multiple generations, and that might be that they have multiple lodges. Sometimes a single family will also have multiple lodges that they move between, but it's also possible that they've left enough space that their kids and their grandkids, they kind of have a multi-family dwelling community really close together. But still, it's not hundreds. And often you hear about people trapping out, say, what they are finding to be problem beavers, ones they don't want, and they keep getting more and more beavers. And that's because when you open up a space and take out the family unit that is there, then the ones that Emily talked about that are looking for homes keep coming in and keep coming in and keep coming. Well, it's because there's obviously a good habitat opportunity, and once you remove the ones that were there, then other ones keep trying to come in and use that opportunity. So they probably weren't all there to start if it's a large number that you're finding, because they couldn't all live together because they wouldn't agree with living with each other.
I think we see that with coyotes too. I know ranchers have been shooting coyotes for generations, and I don't think there's any lack of coyotes. They don't end.
Yeah.
So what are some of the common mistakes or challenges you guys have seen with cattle grazing in riparian areas?
I would say, I mean, one of the most common, I think, is just not adequate rest after grazing, and recognizing that riparian areas like drier uplands, like the non-riparian area, they need rest. We sometimes don't give maybe the riparian area as much because it's moisture, so it does grow faster and it seems more well watered. But it also tends to get more use because it is a really preferential place for livestock to hang out at, for not just for the grazing part, but for the other, the shade and the water access itself. So just maybe inadequate rest sometimes, and just kind of following those general principles of poor distribution can really lead to that overuse. And again, it's not necessarily the cows are eating too much, it's that they're hanging out and trampling and lounging around in the riparian area a lot, because again, that's a really preferred area. So good distribution tools like moving your water somewhere else, your salt somewhere not with your water, shade and shelter elsewhere, all of those kinds of things that are just general good practices really are important in riparian areas.
I'd add to that, working specifically in places that have had a lot of wildfire. A mistake that I've seen is people putting the cows out just like they did before the fire happened. And whereas before there was great, pasture everywhere and there's lots of vegetation, now there's just these strips and they're small and they were the beaver wetlands. And it's not just the cows that are coming there now, it's everything. It's the moose, it's the elk, it's the bears. There's just an incredible amount of pressure on these small patches. And even though we can see them persist through a mega fire, so much stacked on top of that afterwards, we lose it. And it's not enough time for the rest of the riparian to bounce back yet. So especially year 1, year 2 after a fire, if you can supplement with hay, if you can supplement with something else, this is the decision you make in those first 2 years can affect the long-term recovery of these landscapes. They need the seed bank intact. They need patches of greenery intact, and we can overdo it. The other thing, which I hadn't really thought about a lot till this last summer when we were doing a lot of beaver cattle research out in Wyoming, was there's one site where, for whatever reason, they constantly drove the cows downstream, like through the stream network, and they were just constantly walking in the stream, and it was really, really trampled to pieces. And then at a different site, they had them cross and then walk on the other side, and then cross back and then walk on the other side. And even though they were still intersecting with the stream, it was a lot less damage, and we saw the beavers able to repair it a lot faster. And so that one, maybe it's a very specific case study, but if you're making a choice to walk your cows 10 kilometers down a stream, it's going to be pretty hard on the stream. But if you can just cross them when you need to cross them and stay on dry land, at least for a little bit more of that stretch, it made a huge difference, a lot more impactful than I had expected.
I could see that for sure. How much value is there then in pumping out of those? So say those vulnerable areas after a wildfire or a severe drought, is there value in pumping out instead of letting the animals have direct access, even if it's for a short period of time?
I mean, all the research is super clear. There's endless studies showing the improved weight gain on your livestock, improved herd health because you have less parasite issues because they're drinking cleaner water. You don't have to even fence it out. It's just cleaner water because they're less hanging around and trampling in the water, and obviously they're not leaving their manure and urine and sometimes parasites with it. So although all the studies show lots of improved weight gain, so the economics are there, it pays for the water usually in very short order. And then of course there's the ecological benefits and values, for sure. And the behavior research shows that at least 80% of the time, cattle will water out of the trough, the exact same water and no fence. So you move the trough back from the water, pump the same water. The cows could go drink out of the creek or the lake shore or whatever, and they generally choose not to because it's better footing. It's a little cleaner water. It's the same water, but it's cleaner. And so the one thing I would see, the most common mistake I would see with offsite watering systems is people put them right on the bank or right on the shore. Like they're basically on the edge of the water. So put them back further and you'll get a lot more benefits for both the ecosystem, but also for the cattle and the forage base, because they'll have better distribution. Obviously, there'll be less pressure right at the water's edge. And it, even if you need a bit more lift or pumping power, it's definitely worth it because they pay for themselves in spades.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned moving a salt block away, and I really like that tip. I think it was actually at a Cows and Fish workshop the first time I heard you guys mention that. And it's one of those like simple, easy to do things. We used to throw a salt block on a pile of weeds. Like, so say there's a Canada thistle patch, throw it there, let them trample that down instead of the riparian area. So that's just an interesting, yeah, I love that you threw that out there, Norine. What are some practical BMPs ranchers can use, like that one, to protect riparian health while still being able to graze the cattle? So I know we've talked about a few, but are there any you guys want to add?
I think there's lots, and like the salt block or mineral, depending what you're using, is so low tech and so inexpensive. It's just putting it in a different place. So really thinking about simple, cheap stuff. That could be even taking especially in riparian areas, making sure you have gates in multiple places. So this is interesting. We've talked to a number of producers who have this. They have a riparian pasture, so the actual pasture unit is mostly riparian, and then they can control timing and intensity in the season. But making sure you have gates in multiple spots, so they're not always going in the same spot, because cattle behavior is basically wherever they enter, they spend a disproportionate amount of time at and near that spot, because that's also where they're going to go back out. And whether it's they're tired of the area or they just like hanging out at gates, they spend an inordinate amount of time near that. So having multiple spots means you can really change distribution. So that's pretty low tech. Plus, if they get in there and you don't want them in, having gates in multiple places also just makes it more practical to get them out, or whatever, something else gets in there. You can leave the gates down, to reduce wildlife damage. So leaving the gates open when you're not in the adjacent pastures means, not fixing it because the moose walk through it as much, or the elk or whatever. So really simple things like that. The offsite watering thing, I think, again, just giving your cattle as many options as possible for water, and as far away from the water source as possible. Sometimes that's more costly, but it does actually really pay for itself, and it gives you better use of the rest of the grazing resource that you have. And moving water around, sometimes you obviously don't want to create a whole bunch of hot spots because there's always going to be trampling near a watering system, wherever that might be. But thinking about portability, mobility, so you have more options. Those are a couple. I can go on, but maybe Emily wants to jump in.
I would say add beavers if you don't have them, and if you do have them, try to keep them around, because disturbance and damage will happen, and beavers can fix a lot of that, and they are very driven to fix a lot of that. They are instinctually pushed to create a healthy riparian wetland and to maintain that healthy riparian wetland. So if there's been grazing, a lot of what the beavers are doing through their ecosystem engineering creates resilience, and it creates very dynamic, but still sort of, in air quotes, stable landscapes that can be nudged out of their preferred state over and over and over again and come right back to it. And if you don't have ecosystem engineers on site, then you're relying entirely on the hydrology and the physics and the geomorphology of the system, and that's not always enough. And so it can be, in my opinion, also a low-hanging fruit to just let the beavers be there and let them do their thing, especially if they're not actively causing serious damage to your property. It does mean giving up some control of the waterway. Beavers are extremely controlling. We can out-engineer them in many ways, but we can't out-stubborn them. And like Norine mentioned earlier, they'll always be coming back. So even if you are removing them, once it's good habitat and it's opened up, there will always be beavers trying to be there unless you ruin the habitat. And that's usually not people's goal. They would not want to have a bad habitat. You can make a concrete parking lot. A beaver won't come to that, but that's also not going to serve you in other ways. So bring back the beavers, let them be there. manage the conflicts when they arise, because they will arise, they always do. But we can take pond levels down, we can fence off areas. Beavers respond very well to electric fencing if they really cannot go in a certain space. Don't manage them just like the cows, but like if you manage cows, think about managing the beavers. It's another animal that's more difficult sometimes, but it's a challenge that can work to your benefit.
And you
Yeah,
said bring beavers in. What does that look like?
Oh yeah, that varies so much place to place. A lot of places, what that looks like is just stopping the removal process. A lot of time beavers are going to find their way there on their own, especially if there is a healthy population within the watershed. We are in North America at about 10% of the historic population, so even places that feel very beaver rich probably had a lot more in the past, lot more in the past, and there's a lot of room that they could occupy still. So if they're hydrologically connected to you somewhere, let them come on their own. If it's in rough shape, if you have a riparian zone that maybe isn't doing well and the degradation is pronounced, you can do beaver mimicry in some places, not all, where you build a fake beaver dam. And that starts to restore the stream and make it better habitat. And then once it's better habitat, let the beavers come. In some places, though, there are not beavers left in the watershed still. Even 150 years post fur trade, they're gone. And in some places, it's 100 plus miles to the nearest beaver pond. And in some places, you are allowed to relocate beavers from one place to another. That can be an incredibly powerful tool for overcoming sort of these legacy effects of near extinction. But it is not something to be done lightly. You have to relocate entire families. You can't pick and choose beavers, or their social structure falls apart and they're all having a much lower chance of survival. The time of the year matters. You don't want to pluck them when there's little babies in the lodge, but you also don't want to do it right before winter when they need to have their food cache ready. So that's your last resort. It's also the hardest to get permitted usually. It is allowed in some places. It's not allowed in a lot of other places. Policies are changing constantly as beavers are recognized more for their benefits with restoration and resilience. But for most places, especially in Canada and especially like in Minnesota where I am in the Great Lakes region, you just need to take a step back from over managing the beavers and they'll show up on their own.
yeah, I totally agree. I think if you give them habitat or leave them habitat, they will come. And I mean that's probably the biggest reason they're absent is the habitat is substandard, or it's too small a pieces as surrounded by not great habitat, and of course constant persecution. Obviously even if you aren't personally removing beavers, on the landscape as a whole in North America, we're still like there's a lot of problem beavers in quotes, and they're being removed, so it's hard for them to find new places because they are obviously being removed. And I think they do cause problems though. So that's to Emily's point, is really thinking about kind of preemptively thinking about how do I address the problem? Like what is your ideal goal or outcome? What should this place look like, or could it look like? Adding beavers isn't necessarily the solution, because they can cause, you don't want to get yourself in a position where you bring beavers in and you or then your neighbors or your county has all kinds of road problems that they didn't already have with plug culverts,
Your well gets
flooded
plugged up.
roads. Right. So I think if, really thinking about preemptively, like if we did a better job of building roads and infrastructure with beavers in mind in advance, I mean, we're not going back in time but we're getting better. Trail management in recreation areas and things like that. But pond levelers, culvert exclusion, fencing, there's great designs and approaches to do those kinds of things so that we can kind of mitigate the conflict that we have with beavers sometimes, which is usually infrastructure based, and still get the benefits of beavers. But to Emily's point, and this certainly applies in Alberta where we do most of our work, you have to have permitting to do all of these things because you're in a water body and you can't just move wildlife without permitting either. We're actually in the middle of a pilot project right now, just starting to hopefully, honestly, potentially move one of the first beaver projects in Alberta this year and next, hopefully, following permitting once we get that permit. So that with agricultural producers. So that will be, but we're trying to do all these things to prevent future problems because there's no point in moving a beaver to a later death that you didn't plan for, you didn't move the whole family, none of the neighbors want it, right?
Or put it in a location where it's just going to end up being killed by another beaver.
Yeah, all those things that Emily talked about that beavers need, we need to plan for those things if we're going to do anything with beavers. But if you have the habitat, a lot of times then they will come without having to do that, and they'll find the right places.
That's fantastic. And what myths or misconceptions about cows, beavers, and riparian health would you guys most want to bust?
Well,
Play
I think one of
Mythbusters here.
my favorites slash not favorites is a lot of people have heard the term beaver fever to refer to Giardia, or sometimes people use it to refer to when they drink E. coli rich water. And in many cases, it's not the beavers that put the Giardia or the E. coli in the water. It is people, it is dogs, it is cows. And a great rule of thumb is to not worry so much about who's putting the Giardia in the water, and maybe don't drink sediment-rich, unfiltered water. And our waterways are just not that healthy. I hear it so often, like, oh, if I let beavers back, there's going to be Giardia in my water. And I'm like, promise you, it's already there. It's there. It's not the beavers doing it. And there's even been some recent research out of the UK finding that beaver dams and beaver complexes can help reduce the E. coli in the water. The dam can act as a physical barrier, and the binding on defined sediments can help knock it out of the water column. So I think that's a big myth, is that beavers bring lots of disease, because they are a rodent. People have thoughts about rodents and disease that are many of them are founded. But most of the time, the beavers are not bringing an immediate health risk to anybody. The beavers are just living in the ecosystem like many other things. Muskrats also carry boatloads of Giardia, so let's not just pick an animal we don't like and then blame it for everything.
Yeah, that's a really good one. I think one of the other kind of, I'll say, maybe fun ones, depending how you look at it, is beavers eat fish. They don't eat fish. They do swim with fish, maybe, I'm sure, because we aren't underwater with them, but they don't eat fish, so they're not the reason we don't have as many fish as there used to be. That's kind of habitat management, loss of stream integrity and connectivity, colder water being lost for trout, all the things we've kind of talked about with lack of health, and overfishing and hybridization with non-native species of fish and all kinds of things. So that's kind of one that's fun. And also that beavers are bad for fish, like that they block fish movement. They cause fish populations to decline because they're ecosystem engineers, they wreck the place for fish. But of course we know there used to be a lot more beavers and a lot more fish, before settlement. And it's not that beavers are the reason. It's true that occasionally fish can't get through a dam at some stage of their life or at some point in time. But on the whole, they get through leaky dams. They get over and under and through leaky dams and at different sizes of fish. So it's more about there's only tiny remnants of fish populations left. It's like, oh, I don't want them to be blocked because it's because there's so few fish left that we are actually targeting and thinking it's the beavers that are the problem. I would say that's pretty common. One other interesting myth I think we see in riparian areas often is that cows eat grass and they don't eat trees and shrubs. And same with beavers, that beavers only eat trees and shrubs. Maybe 50% of their diet is woody material. For cows, it's a lot less than 50% is woody, but they eat a lot of trees and shrubs. So kind of just understanding that these organisms, whether it's cows or beavers, actually don't just eat one thing. They eat a lot of diverse things, and sometimes they're both eating the same kinds of things.
That's great. I found out a few years that black bears graze grass, and I actually have a video of a black bear grazing grass, and I'm like, what? I don't know when I'll use that video, but it's great. And yeah, it kind of speaks to that too. I think we have this idea that, well, this animal eats this, and it's not always the case. Well, this has been amazing, girls. Where can listeners go for more information, whether it's cows or fish, resources, or research like yours, Emily? Where can they go?
For my research, I have a website, emilyfairfaxscience.com. And then my lab also runs an Instagram page, Fairfax Beaver Lab, and that's where we post most of our recent research, our cool findings, pictures from us out in the field, interesting beaver dams, all of what we're doing and why we're doing it.
Great.
For Cows and Fish, you can go to Cows and Fish's website, which is cowsandfish.org. We're on quite a few of the different social medias and YouTube. And we also have, with our collaborative, Working with Beavers collaborative, so our Working with Beavers website has lots of videos and beaver-specific stuff in addition to things on our website about riparian and grazing.
Well, thank you guys so much. And that was Dr. Emily Fairfax and Norine Ambrose on Real Agriculture.
Thank you
And I'll
so
have
much.
that.
It was a really fun interview.